Hello and welcome to Chile Talk, a series of videos about life in contemporary Chile. My name is Neil Davidson. This is Pete Lee, a Chilenologist or a Chileanist. What was it?
Oh, well, hey, I like to mix it up.
That's it. And this video is going to be a fairly straightforward informational one about Chilean political parties. So just to sort of briefly say that Chilean political parties are pretty recognisable from what you know in other Western countries, or as people say, in Western countries, since you're not quite convinced that Chile is a Western country.
Yes, there are a lot of political parties here in Chile.
More than you'd expect to find in a Western country?
Well, I'm going to try to discuss them in terms of left and right. It's going to try my powers of concentration, but
yeah, okay. But
it is vaguely consistent with a Western notion of left and right, I think.
I think so. I mean, I suppose when you think about the right, you tend to think of economically liberal, socially conservative, and when you think of the left, it's the opposite. It's like economically dirigiste, statist, and more interested in stuff like minority rights, sexual freedoms. And that pretty much holds true for Chile, doesn't it?
Yes, in general. There are a couple of points that we'll go through as we go through the parties, but I think that's generally true.
Okay, so why not take it from the right? Who's rightmost on the Chilean political spectrum?
Well, now the rightmost political movement, or somewhat viable political movement, is called El Partido Republicano.
The Republican Party?
Yes, which
Very
is
uninformative name, so good thing we got you here to explain it.
Yes, which is run by J.A. Kast, the son of a German immigrant, post-World War II immigrant, and it's basically inspired by the movement towards populist nationalism, as Steve Bannon would call it on behalf of Donald Trump. So appealing to nationalist tendencies.
Can you think of a policy offhand?
Well, Chileans first would be a policy rather than immigrants. So some kind of interchange with xenophobia, although there's no signs that he's going to play the xenophobia card. There's no signs that he's not. And Kast might be going very hard when the elections come around in 2021.
That's right, because I mean it's interesting that nobody really has played the xenophobia card that I know of in politics, and Chile has had a lot of immigration after having very little for many decades. Really, there was, I mean, after the early 20th century, there was a certain amount of Peruvian immigration, mainly in the 80s, perhaps during the dictatorship.
There was very little. I mean,
but even then, you know, there was a certain amount of disgruntlement. I've had, you know, Chilean cleaning ladies talk to me about how wages were going up years ago, and the Peruvians came in and they went down again. You know, this is obviously a common complaint about against especially unskilled immigrants, when unskilled people are competing with them.
Yes.
But anyway, after there being very little immigration for decades and decades and decades, in the last 5 years, the complexion of the country has changed enormously.
5 or 10, yes. It's been very rapid. Initially, a lot of Colombians were added to Peruvians and Bolivians, and now, of course, Venezuelans,
Haitians.
Yes.
You know, you did not really see black people, for example, in Chile 10 years ago, and now, you know, there are very, very large numbers of black people, and you hear lots of accents, Central American accents. And interesting enough, this immigration has spread. It's not confined to Santiago. You can go to small country towns, you know, farms, and you'll find Haitians, Colombians.
Yes.
You know, so it's been immensely quick, tremendously quick. You know, the question of why, for example, in Britain, you do not see a black face in Somerset or rural Somerset or Dorset, whereas in Chile, with such a recent immigration, you're seeing black farm workers, is a very interesting question, which actually somebody should study, because if they haven't already.
Yes, all people are studying this, and it's an interesting thing. But xenophobia and related issues may have some bearing on right-wing politics in in Chile. The older established right-wing parties, and the right-wing bloc that's in power at the moment is called Chile Vamos.
Let's go for it, Chile.
Yes, let's go for it, Chile, led by
Sounds very
Sebastian
exciting.
Piñera. Yes. Its largest party, and the largest political party in Chile, is called URI.
Unión Democrática Independiente, Independent Democratic Union. Again, another of those names is not very informative.
Yes, it's an interesting tradition. The URI, it's called gremialism or guildism, a particular Catholic ideology historically, opposed to the idea of class tension.
That's right, in which people tend to be organised into interest groups, professional associations, rather than being seen either as atomised individuals or as great social lumps of social class.
Yes, with strong links to what is called the Chilean military family, so conservative people. And that party was established, with the return to democracy from the late 1980s, for the 1990 return to democracy, initially led by Jaime Guzman,
who was the great sort of political ideologue of the dictatorship. In fact, he wrote the constitution. He was a syndicalist, though those ideas got rather left behind when the dictatorship wasn't at the beginning quite sure what it was there for. Was syndicalist and then went all kind of free market and neoliberal. But he retained his prestige, and he had sufficiently to actually be assassinated after the end of the
in
dictatorship.
1991, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, when we say syndicalist, he believed in the concept of syndicalism rather than trade unionism, which is another...
Well, as in Britain at least, trade unions are trade unions, and so syndicalist doesn't evoke that at all.
No.
But so, there's a direct link back there to the dictatorship, isn't there?
Yes, and before the tensions between Catholic progressivism in the 1960s and a sort of fight back against that by the gremialist movement.
Yeah.
The other big party of the right is called Renovación Nacional.
National Renewal.
Yes, which is part of a very long Chilean nationalist tradition, which is very Chilean. It's importantly the Chilean nation, not nations in general. It has its own way of thinking about things, which is not traditionally aligned to ideas like racial supremacy or anything like that. But it is related to ideas of national sovereignty.
Yeah, which are very big in Latin America generally, aren't they?
Yes, and that particular party's made a big lunge for what is called the middle class here, which basically means the voting poor, I would say.
Right. People who can afford some kind of car, usually, and have a sort of office job, probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you call them middle class, you're indicating to them that they're better than someone else, and you're out for their interests.
And they're aspirational, and you're with them in that aspiration. Exactly.
Yes. Like a lot of places in Latin America, the evangelical Protestant churches are an important clientele for that group, more than URI. So that's a growing group.
Which party is Sebastián Piñera from?
Well, he's moved from Renovación Nacional and became an independent. So he's sort of seen as a pan right-wing businessman.
That's right, because the coalition, so the coalition includes UDI, includes Renovación Nacional.
Yes, and another important group would be Evópoli. Evópoli is largely made up of people who came out of URI, also from Renovación Nacional and other sites, which is much more socially progressive. They're not as hung up on social conservatism.
Got it.
In some ways, some of their economic and law and order policies seem even more right-wing than the other parties, but they're an example of a sort of generational change. They're trying to distinguish themselves, Evópoli, from the older political movements. I
see. Yes, because it's interesting that you tend to imagine the poorer people voting, for state handouts for the left, basically, but here, the middle class, as it's called, is quite right-wing, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Looking for its own kinds of handouts.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, Sebastián Pinera was very popular at one time, and he was, you know, voting for a second term. And, well, you know, he promised economic growth. And people look back, and in his first term, he did deliver it. Growth was very strong. It was 5, 6, even 7% a year. But essentially, he got lucky, really. There was a global boom. Copper price went up, very important in Chile. And so he could boast, he stood for election promising more of the same, which it wasn't in his power to deliver. And so this time the global economy disappointed, and so his popularity pretty much plummeted.
Yes.
And the middle class is, as you say, the class of aspiration. They thought they were going to see more growth, more jobs, you know, more rapid wage increases, and that was, I guess, what they wanted from him.
And hasn't been delivered. And there's another small regionalist middle-class party as well in Chile, Vamos, and that's basically the right-wing coalition there. The centre in Chile is interesting because everybody talks about being in the centre. Everybody on the right wants to be centre-right. Everybody, well, probably everybody on the left probably is centre-left, but the centre is considered a very, very desirable clientele, but doesn't seem to have its own dedicated parties at the moment. There have been a few attempts to establish parties for the centre, but they seem to founder. Amplitude is one, which is width or breadth. Ciudadanos is another.
Citizens.
Couldn't come together, led by Andres Velasco, who's a minister in Michelle Bachelet's government.
That's right. That's right. He was the minister of the economic minister of finance. What was it called? Hacienda.
Yes. So there's no obvious party. What is in the centre probably is the rump of the old Christian Democrat movement, which is called the Christian Democrats. Formerly a very important political party, both sides of the military government of Pinochet in the 1960s, heavily supported by the United States as an alternative to sort of Marxian socialism. And in the 1990s, also heavily supported by various parts of politics. So there's been 3 presidents from the Christian Democrat movement.
That's right. So before Allende, Eduardo Frei was Christian Democrat. He was president, and they weren't just American puppets. In fact, he started nationalising the copper mines, didn't he?
Yes.
From the mainly American owners.
Yes. A similar thing happened in Peru, where Peru's Kennedyan figure, much like Frei, Belaunde, nationalised various natural resources as well. And in the 1990s, there was a certain triumphalism in the return to that rather than return to, say, the Socialist Party immediately, which was the party of Salvador Allende, who was overthrown by Pinochet. So there were 2 presidents in the 1990s, Aluin, and then another Frei, Eduardo Frei.
Second Eduardo Frei. Both from the Christian Democrats.
Both from the Christian Democrat Party. And they've kind of faded as a group. They were positioned themselves as the largest and most powerful members of a centre-right coalition that was called the Concertación in the 1990s up until 2006 or 2010, 2006.
Right, so they governed continuously from the end of the dictatorship until then. This left of centre coalition.
Yeah, so centre and left, I guess, a combination. Now the Christian Democrat Party's fallen out with the major centre-left coalition, which is called Convergencia Progresista.
They kept changing the name.
Yeah, this is a name change. Prior to that, they were Nueva Mayoría.
That's right. So it was new. So first of all was the consultation, then it was new majority.
Yes.
And then it was what was the last one?
The progressive convergence.
Progressive convergence. Okay.
Yes.
Memorable stuff. Okay, so that's the centre really.
Yeah, so there is no centre. Basically, the centre is there's no centre, but the Christian Democrats have broken off, and they're looking more and more like a centre-right party, as the Christian Democrats are in Europe.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So, well, we should go through...
Moving left now, then.
Convergencia Progresista, which is the main centre-left bloc. This consists of the Party for Democracy, which is a sort of personality cult of Ricardo Lagos, who was president. He was a president promising reform, but actually associated with quite a bit of corruption, as it turns out. Very famous for standing up to Pinochet in the 1980s.
That's right, near the end of the dictatorship, when it was just about getting safe to do so, and he stood up on television, wasn't it, and wagged a finger at the camera, addressing Pinochet and calling him out on any number of things.
Yes, calling him a liar for yes, for possibly holding back on elections. That's.
It was effective, it was quite brave, and it got results. He eventually did get the top job.
He did get the top job in the end. Another group is called the Radical Party. The Radical Party actually presented the last centre-left candidate, Alejandro Guillier, who went up against Piñera and lost. It's actually descended from Freemasonry, basically. Much like the Radical Party in Argentina, which...
oh, is that right? And what's radical about it? What do you want to be radical about?
Well, it's radical in the sense of rooting itself in a certain kind of slow change. It's not radical in the sense of radically different, it's radical in the sense of being rooted. In
the sense of being a radish.
Yes. Right. Certain principles. But there were three radical governments from... 1938 until the early 1950s. I think 52 was the end of the last one. It sort of fell out with the Socialist Party at that point. Banned the Communist Party, which was considered a very perfidious act in the 1950s. And there were many attempts to ban communist parties in a lot of countries around the world at the time.
So this was González Videla?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. The president who banned the Communist Party, I think largely to get to irritate Neruda. Yes. But anyway, that's a long story about Neruda, which we won't get into now.
Yeah, it's a meek tradition. Another party in there is the Socialist Party itself. The Socialist Party goes back to...
So that's Allende's party?
Yes. Allende's party, founded by another heavily eccentric guy called Marmaduke Groth.
That's right.
Who was a military figure. And it's a Marxian party. I'm not sure it's entirely Marxist in the sense of class warfare and such, but it's a left-wing tradition and has been important in recent years. Michelle Bachelet, Chile's first female president, was part of the Socialist Party, probably still is. She was not a hugely successful. She was a hugely successful politician, but perhaps not a hugely successful leader in terms of the results, particularly in her second term of government. So that's the main, what's left of the centre-left coalition, I would say.
Okay, so beyond the centre-left, what do we have?
Well, beyond the centre-left, we have another group, which I guess a bit like a Vocally is a generational difference within the right. Beyond Convergencia Progresista, we have another group called Frente Amplio that's mostly...
Broad front,
a younger kind of centre-left aesthetic. even all the way to left in some ways. Called the far left, of course, by the right wing. It's called Frente Amplio, which is the name of a very successful centre-left coalition in Uruguay, which has a very good reputation internationally. One of the darling movements of the Marea Rosa, the pink tide of left-leaning governments in Latin America, led by Jose Mujica, a very successful ex-communist guerrilla in Uruguay. And Frente Amplio has taken the name of that Uruguayan group, and it is made up of a lot of parties. Well, it's made up of 4 parties. You've got the Partido Liberal, the Liberal Party. There's been a lot of parties in the history of Chile called Partido Liberal, much like Partido Republicano. It's simply a name. There's no science what it means. There's also another party called Comunes, which is run by
communes or commons.
Commons, yeah. A bunch of academics, basically. Most of these Frente Amplio parties and also the Socialist Party run on something that's called internal party democracy, which, especially under Corbynism, was used in the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. It leads to some interesting factional dynamics. Another party is called Revolución Democrática.
Democratic Revolution.
Yes, it's led by Giorgio Jackson,
former student leader.
a successful student leader in 2010, 2011. It's hasn't notably moved beyond student politicking in terms of its positioning. They're against unlimited term limits. Jackson himself will be retiring after 2 terms in the Congress, and they only receive about 3% of the vote, a little under 3% of the vote, but possibly they'll be more viable in the future, who knows. And there's another group which is called Convergencia Social.
Okay, social convergence, not to be confused with the other convergence we had earlier.
Progressista. And that is basically based around a group of student politicians as well. Boric, Sharp in Valparaiso, a couple of characters who have links to Magallanes in the far south of Chile, which has a strong sort of autonomous tradition. And that convergence is formed out of a bunch of other small little parties. Seems to be the more left-wing part of Frente Amplio. Beyond Frente Amplio, I would put further to the left, simply for reasons of the importance of public ownership and statism and so on. I would put the Chilean Communist Party, which has been around since the earliest part of the 20th century. I believe it's the oldest communist party in Latin America. I might be wrong about that. It's been banned a couple of times, at least a couple of times. And its main role in life is drawing analogies between any poor treatment towards it and the treatment by the Pinochet regime of the Communist Party of that time. It's a nostalgist sort of party. Has been very successful in attracting young figureheads to it, and always is a voice in university politics and high school politics. But
so the enchantment never quite dies, so?
No, absolutely. It's a very enchanted dynamic, and those are all of the parties represented in the Congress
Mhm.
at the moment. Or I think Marco Enrique Ominami
Mhm.
has a seat, not himself, but
He's kind of independent.
Yeah, he's a sort of independent
Mhm. Mhm.
on the left. But I can't think of any others off the top of my head. There may be more.
Well, that's already quite a lot. Chile clearly has a lot of political parties. I'm, as always, dazzled and slightly bewildered by your erudition, Pete, on subjects Chilean. And on that note, I guess we can wrap it up. I'll wrap up our little tour through Chilean politics. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you next time.
Thanks.